It's been nearly a month and a half since the insurrection at the United States Capitol, and still so many unanswered questions. Like, why haven't the Capitol Police had a single press conference to discuss what they went through that day? Just how did Officer Brian Sicknick lose his life while defending the Capitol? These questions and many others are what Speaker Nancy Pelosi hopes to have answers for by establishing an independent investigation similar to the 9/11 Commission to find out exactly what happened on January 6th. The inquiry would have to involve legislation and bipartisan support to commence. So will there be enough Republican support to form a commission to get these answers? Let's bring into our conversation NBC News investigative correspondent Tom Winter and Frank Figluzzi, MSNBC national security analyst, former FBI assistant director for counterintelligence, and author of the new book, The FBI Way. Let me start with you, Frank, on your theory of the case for why we have not heard. We actually heard the House impeachment managers tell the most detailed version of their story that day, but we still have not heard from Capitol Police.
There's an overriding historical reason why people don't tell their story, or institutions choose not to tell their story. It's because even they don't like their story. I'm concerned that we're not hearing from these agencies because the truth is too painful even for them. And I think it's going to be the independent commission that finally gets to the bottom of this, if we can even assemble an effective commission. But there's a reason why we aren't getting regular press conferences, why we aren't seeing lengthy testimony as is scheduled, hopefully, for next week as we start to hear the story. But the reason why they're not voluntarily coming forward, Nicole, is I fear the story is ugly, even for...
I'm going to stop right there. Whenever I first heard this, it reminded me of me, pertaining to how many times have I voiced my opinion about the occurrences that's happened throughout the lifespan of the Windmill Ministries, going all the way back into the 80s, as well as into the 90s up in Wheeling, West Virginia, as well as all these churches that showed their rear ends whenever the ministry first started out in the late 80s, early 90s, that I got absolutely no support for. All these agencies up in Kentucky, regardless whether it's state agencies, federal agencies, or local pertaining to Land Between the Lakes agencies, I still haven't heard nothing coming out of the Oklahoma state in regards to them changing their opinion about what actually happened, not just with the truck bombing that they planted in the back of my truck, but also with the fake, false accusations that they posted up onto my life that I had threatened one of their police officers. And even though the charges had been dropped, their news agencies in Oklahoma still has not cleared that up yet. And also pertaining to this particular agency that I'm right here in Weakley County, pertaining to the sheriff's department and also the state prosecutors, as well as the judges, of how come hasn't none of them come forth. And this is exactly the reason why. And I just got through talking to a friend of mine a while ago. He was explaining to me, he said, Dennis, this is common. I said, why? He said, because they don't want to incriminate themselves. If you look at what it says pertaining to your well, they call it something rights. I don't forgot now, memorial rights or something like that. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. In other words, if they speak up involuntarily, regardless whether it's the Martin PD, regardless whether it's the Kenton PD pertaining to the City Hall, or the City Hall in Martin, or the City Hall in Dresden, or Dresden Courthouse, or the Sheriff's Department in Weakley County, either of these agencies, if they speak up, their story is so demonizing that it's actually going to come back and bite them. And if the truth be known, as my friend was talking a while ago, we probably didn't know the extent of the civil rights movement until years later, until that documentation actually become known to the general public, pertaining to people that had filmed those incidences and held on to that material. Why the law enforcement agencies does this is for the benefit of themselves. It's not for the benefit of those that they've had dealings with. It's for the benefit of themselves, because that way they can remain neutral and they can keep everybody guessing. And it basically makes people such as myself or Martin Luther King or some of the other people that fought and got beat up and got criminalized during various movements that happened during the civil rights movement. It leaves them at doubt. It leaves them at question towards, well, rather not, is their story legitimate or is it illegitimate? Are they telling the truth? Are they not telling the truth? Whenever I continue to tell my story again and again and again, and my story does not deviate, that's a pretty good indication that I'm telling the truth. Especially whenever I tell my story, and a lot of times I'll tell it in the behalf of saying, I've got documentation, I've got paperwork to verify this. In other words, I'm not just whistling Dixie. I can actually back up and sustain that in which what I'm talking about, regardless whether it was the incident in Wheeling, West Virginia, pertaining to Homeland Security, or it was the incident that happened in 1991, the incident that happened in 1989 in Madison County, whenever the ministry first got started, the incident, all these different incidences, I can sustain, I can back up, because I was smart enough. God gave me the ability to understand that what I was doing was important enough that I needed to hang on to every document. It didn't matter if it was on digital form. It didn't matter if it was on video form. It didn't matter if it was on VHS form. It didn't matter if it was on paper form. And yes, I've got documentation whenever I first got introduced to the psychiatric community down in Bolivar, Tennessee, going all the way back to 1983. I've got their whole examination profile about me, of what they said and how they said it, and how they, I'm going to use the word, criticize or demonize me, even though what I was talking about then was the same thing that I'm talking about now, pertaining to the Antichrist, the false prophet, the witnesses, the two witnesses that it talks about coming out of the Bible, talking about the translation of what Daniel was talking about in end-time biblical Bible prophecies. The very exact same thing that I was talking about and that God had moved upon to me in 1983 after two hands miraculously come out of heaven, that I physically felt as a 4,000-pound automobile come crashing down on top of me that should have cut me in half. The very same ideology, the very same thought patterns, the very same interest is still in my head today as it was in 1983, whenever I know that God had spared my life for something, for a purpose. But yet, no, I still don't see no movement here in the community or among the churches, other than it being still a resistance movement that, as far as I'm concerned, is kind of like a Mexican standoff. It's a group of people that says this and another group of people that says that, and nothing is really getting accomplished. That's the only thing that I see. I mean, I'm still getting my story out to the general public, pertaining to even the encounters that I had with the Weakley County Sheriff's Department, going as far back as a year ago, whenever they decided to send out a deputy out here that I recorded, I put it on some of my platforms as well as other materials of that deputy telling me that if I went back to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma on their 25th memorial marathon, that I would be arrested on the spot. Now, you can call it as it is. You can say, well, Dennis, they was doing that out of courtesy towards coming out here telling you that. Was they? Was they? Or is it a group of people that once more is refusing to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, to the general public because they're afraid that the general public is going to catch on to them, that they have lied to them? And of course, if you've ever lied one time, then from then on, every word that you say is going to be under scrutiny towards people going to be suspicion of you telling the truth. Even though you may be telling the truth, they're still going to be in doubt towards telling a lie. The Oklahoma authorities lied to their own people about what actually occurred with the Oklahoma bombing pertaining to Timothy McVeigh and Nichols. Just like the authorities did not tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, pertaining to the Waco incident that happened down at Mount Carmel, pertaining to David Koresh and the Davidians. They tell what they want to tell, when they want to tell it, to their benefit, to their upkeeping, because they don't want to incriminate themselves. And it doesn't matter if it's pertaining to the civil rights movement. It doesn't matter to the other types of movements that's happened up in New York and up in Wisconsin and other places all over the countryside. And that tells me the bogussy of how bogus that these agencies really are, regardless whether they be state agencies, local agencies, federal agencies. It tells me how bogus that they really are pertaining to transparency with the American people. And I thought, and I've always thought it, that we was working above the board towards operating by the book and not throwing the book out and operating below the board. But apparently, we're still operating today the way that was back in the 50s and the 60s, and how that the black people was taken advantage of and not treated fairly. And even to this day, pertaining to George Floyd, we can still see the results from that type of hatred and that type of movement that has not been stifled out to this day. It has still not been stifled out. So once more, until the American people are willing to do a full 180-degree turn towards coming clean with all these events that has in fact happened with the Windmill Ministries, I'm pretty sure that we're going to continue at this stalemate towards things continually getting worse and worse and worse. And they continue to keep pointing their finger at me because they're the ones that basically left me out to dry. And as they're pointing their finger at me, calling me a liar, are calling me this or calling me that, being a fraudulent or whatever, a blasphemer or whatever, the same as they done Jesus. The finger should actually be pointed back at them. Because I've said this many, many times. This ministry has not failed the people, but rather than the people that has failed the ministry. Why did they not want to take the bull by the horns? Why did they not want to support a ministry that supported not only international global peace, but also a local revival pertaining to peace and utopia here upon to our country, upon to our soil? I'm going to tell you why. Because the majority of them was full of you know what. And because the ideology that I'm preaching, that does in fact come out of the book of Revelations, because of the seriousness that the book of Revelations talks about, they have backed up. Because now this is separating the believers from the make-believers. This is separating them. And because it's separating them, I'll find people, let me put it this way. I'll find certain people in certain environments. And it's usually while they're on their deathbed and I visit them at the hospital or I go to their house. And they'll look at me and say, man, I sure do regret that I never did support you and I never did help you out with that ministry that you felt like that God had called you into, as they're taking their last and final dying breath. They'll tell me these things, which leads me to believe, you're just saying that. Because if the truth be known, if you was still as healthy as an ox and you was up on your feet, you really don't mean what you're saying. You're just saying it because you know now you've been cornered with death, and death is now knocking on your doorstep, and there's now no other alternative other than you trying to come clean in every event that you've been involved in that you either done or you should have done that you didn't do. So I'm finding these falsehoods, these hypocrisies, even to this day, towards people that's rubberneckers want to drive by and see 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255. They want to see the broken cross. They want to view some of my videos, or they want to hear certain things coming from me, but at the same time, they do it with a standoffish attitude. Just like the court system here in Weakley County. Just like the judicial system over in Kenton, Tennessee, or the judicial system in Martin, Tennessee, pertaining to the mayors that has been involved in my life, or the people out in Oklahoma, or the people in Kentucky, or the people down towards Kennesaw, Georgia, in Atlanta. They do it at a standoffish pace. Why? Because they're still trying to protect that agency. They're still trying to protect certain people that was working in that agency that they don't want to incriminate themselves over. It's kind of like the United Pentecostal Church. Various preachers that I bumped into would tell me off the record, Juby, we understand your passion and we believe that you believe in what you believe. And to some extent, they're admitting off the record that, yeah, we know that what you're telling us is true. It's so. But because they are so ingrained in the industry or the corporation or the church that they're involved in, and because it goes against their grain, it goes against their covenant clause, regardless whether it's the Baptist, the Pentecostal, the Church of Christ, the Methodist, the Assembly of God, the Church of God, or whoever, because it goes against their grain, they will not openly, publicly admit to any wrongdoing with that particular church or that particular organization that they're associated with. Once more, they're working for the association more so than they're working for the Lord. Because if they was truly working for the Lord, the Almighty, God Almighty, pertaining to the Lord Jesus Christ, they would come out of that organization because they know that the bylaws that their organization went by was actually strangholding the sinners versus saving the sinners. And we can see that across the nation towards how many churches has been dilapidated just in the past 30 plus years, towards instead of them growing and getting bigger, in actuality, they've gotten smaller. Now, there's been a few of them out there that's grown. There's been a few. The Joe Osteens, the ear-tickling type associations, or even some of the privatized ones. And I'm not going to be judgmental in saying who's sincere, who isn't sincere. I'm going to let God do the judging because that's his job to begin with. I just know this, as far as the windmill ministries, They basically shot me out of the saddle before I ever got out of the gate good, beginning with Ronald Reagan and the Bush administration, whenever 9 tapes wound up at the White House that, yes, I can verify, I can prove. Let's watch this to get some sort of an idea about how that these people work in undermining the public and not bringing transparency to their association and the public in trying to protect themselves of the wrongdoing.
For that.
Tom Winter, most of what we know, as I said, the House managers introduced what I think for a lot of Americans was the most comprehensive version of what the Capitol Police endured that day. But the other way that we're learning, and it's a little more opaque, but are through the charges that are being filed against the insurrectionists themselves. Can you just bring us up to speed with where the investigation stands, the most serious charges that have been brought, and how many people have been charged?
Well, we're approaching about 200 people that have been charged, Nicole, and obviously the investigations continue. Other people continue to get arrested. We've gone from having, in some cases, 6, 8, 10 people arrested a day now to just a handful, and obviously we're waiting. And the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. and the FBI in D.C. have told us repeatedly that the more serious charges, the indictments, the possibility of conspiracy charges here, those cases are going to take time. It makes sense that they would take time. There's a lot of evidence that'll need to be collected and gathered that has nothing to do with these images that we've seen repeatedly since that dark day. I think when we look at the totality of what occurred here, Nicole, the whole undercurrent of your last discussion on what happened in Texas was really about the truth. What is in accountability? And when you look at the 9/11 Commission in that report of 585 pages that went into a detailed timeline, how we arrived on the morning of September 11th, not just from a standpoint of what occurred in the intelligence community and the law enforcement community and what did not occur on that day, and to Frank's point, the story from some of those agencies that had some successes but obviously had some very serious failures in failures of communication and what occurred between those agencies, specifically the CIA and the FBI, what was shared and what was not shared with the FBI. When you look back at the 9/11 Commission report, it established some semblance of truth. And while the CIA may not be happy with their portrayal in it, or the FBI may not be happy with some of their portrayal in it, when you look at that document, which is what it has become, it provides a key reference point in a key set of truths that happened on that day and before it. And I think we're really lacking that here. And I think for a law enforcement agency, the Capitol Police, to receive a $460 million budget, to have provided no briefings. They said that they've suspended officers. I can't tell you who they are because they won't tell anybody. I can't tell you how serious it was, what they may have done. Did they just not follow simple procedure? Were they perhaps encouraging of people that day? What happened with the sergeant at arms? I mean, how do we get to a point in a post 9/11 world that it was so easy to break glass and break doors down and get into the United States Capitol? These are questions that are going to be answered, and they're not going to be answered in those charging documents because those cases have to stick close to the facts and the individuals that were charged, Nicole.
Frank, Tom raises such important points, and obviously, and such an important point about the value of the 9/11 Commission report. The most lasting change was that it changed how the CIA and the FBI interacted with each other. George Tenet was the CIA director, Robert Mueller was the FBI director, and the government went about never again failing to connect the dots, and it changed. Nothing has changed since the insurrection. I mean, Donald Trump not being held to account is just really the tip of the iceberg. Nothing has changed. They've put a fence around it, but in terms of getting to the root cause of how that happened, nothing.
This is the value of an independent commission if we can assemble it in an effective and efficient fashion in this polarized environment we're in. Don't forget, 9/11 was an external threat to the nation. We rallied behind it. We had a common enemy that we needed to address. This is different. This is an internal threat, and I predict you're going to see political infighting about who gets on the commission and how that process works. But here's the value. In addition to the truth telling and getting to the truth of an independent commission, it's, as you said, taking tangible steps so that this won't happen again or is less likely to happen again. Let's not forget, we created DHS as a result of 9/11. We created the DNI position as the result of 9/11. Here's what I hope comes out of an independent commission. I hope we finally get Congress to address the need for a domestic terrorism law. I hope we finally get Congress to acknowledge the role of social media in radicalization and start regulating big tech and the social media platforms.
This is a conversation that we will continue to have with both of you. Thank you for spending some time with us today, Tom Winter and Frank Figliuzzi. When we come back, a chance to...
Boy, good luck in that, because that's kind of like your gun rights here in the state of Tennessee. If they even think that you're coming close to controlling their do's and their don'ts in regards to their gun laws towards having AKs and all kinds of other assault weapons, boy, they'll raise a red flag real quick towards that. Just like these agencies that don't want to be transparent. You know, as long as I'm doing the talking about the problems that I've had with them, they just let me talk. Because in their eyes, legally speaking, I'm just whistling Dixie. Especially if I can't motivate my viewers or a group of people in wanting to support the things that the ministry has long supported for the past 30 some odd years. If I can't make a movement in rallying the people, they're sitting back with their feet against the table, reared back, laughing and hee-hawing about this crazy man is telling all his stories, but nobody's believing him. They done the exact same thing to Noah. Though the concepts was different, but they done the same thing in other prophets of God that come forth with messages. They done the same thing with Jesus Christ. They didn't support Jesus Christ during the time that Jesus Christ was bringing forth his message. That's the reason why I say the church communities has turned into hypocrisy. They do not truly believe in what they claim that they believe in. They do not support the things that they truly say that they support their ambitions in. If they did, they would have gotten in tune with the windmill ministries years and years ago around here locally pertaining to the local church communities, but they never did. Because they was scared. Because it was something a little bit unusual. Because it was serious coming out of the book of Revelations. It wasn't that I was a devil. It wasn't that I was preaching that I was a Jim Jones or a David Koresh. It wasn't that the things that I was preaching wasn't coming accurately out of the King James Version Bible. It was the fact that they themselves was biased. They themselves was bogus. They themselves are hanging on to this world like it's some sort of heavenly kingdom. And the thing about it is, the heavenly kingdom don't have nothing to do with this world that Satan obviously has blinded them and convinced them of obviously of other things. And that's the reason why they strive towards their cars and their big bank accounts and their big houses. In the meantime, I live in a little bitty 700 square foot trailer, which I'm not complaining. I got more than what a lot of people's got. I got property. I've got automobiles, and I got my health, and I got my relationship with God. And to me, if they want me to go around whistling Dixie without them actually being a supporter to the windmill ministries, that's fine. If they can live with what they're not doing, I can live with it too as well. Because eventually, they will stand and give an account. Even those that are on their deathbed that look at me and say, Juby, I sure do wish we supported you. No, you don't. No, you don't. Because if you did, you would have. Have a good trip. Adios, amigos. Good luck to all of us. Wow. Now that's the reality that we're living in here in America.